Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 161st of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the first week of April 2025. In today's podcast, we're going to discuss the Kryvyi Rih massacre. Russians killed 20 people, including 9 children. And we're going to discuss Putin's envoy in Washington, what he has achieved or not. Kryvyi Rih attack. On Monday, anger and outrage gripped the hometown of Ukrainian President Zelensky as it held funerals for some of the 20 victims, including 9 children killed by a Russian missile that tore through apartment building and blasted at a kids' playground. Over 70 people were injured in the attack in Kryvyi Rih and last Friday evening. At that time, children were playing on swings and in a sandbox in a three-line park. Bodies lay scattered across the grass. Russia fired ballistic missiles targeting residential neighborhood in the central city of Kryvyi Rih on Friday. The death toll from the Russian missile strike on Kryvyi Rih has risen as of today to 20 people. So Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky, who comes from Kryvyi Rih, says the youngest to lose their life this Friday attack was just 3 years old. So local authorities said that the strike damaged some 20 apartment buildings, close to 3,000 vehicles, an education facility, and a restaurant. The city authorities say the missile targeted a residential neighborhood, which was way far from any military bases. The missile struck an area right next to a residential building, hitting a playground where ordinary people located, said President Zelensky. The Russian Defense Ministry said it carried out a high precision missile strike with a high explosive warhead on a restaurant where a meeting with unit commanders and Western instructors were taking place, which was a false statement. The Kremlin says that the attack killed 85 military personnel and foreign officers and destroyed 20 vehicles used for military purposes. Kiev rejected those claims and accused Moscow of deliberately targeting civilians and children. Russian strikes are continuing to target Ukrainian cities daily. Kiev says almost 100 drones were launched into Ukraine overnight, with 51 shut down by air defenses. And let's not forget that Russia, Ukraine, and the United States agreed to the ceasefire, but it doesn't stop Russia. Russia keeps killing civilians and children on a daily basis. So let's talk about the visit of Kirill Dmitriev to Washington last week, which was the aim of the visit was to rebuild relationships between Russia and the United States. Let's see how it went. In my opinion, Kirill Dmitriev did not accomplish much during his visit to Washington. In any case, both official and unofficial sources in Russia are not enthusiastic about the visit from the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. They report a meeting with US officials but provide no information on the outcomes. Additionally, the overall tone of the message is not very favorable. As far as I understand, the task of Putin's special representative for investment and economic cooperation with foreign countries was more about bringing Trump a bag of goodies. This means that interaction with Russia could potentially open up the Russian market for the US and establish certain business interests. In Moscow, they likely believe that Trump acts primarily as a businessman. However, it seems Dmitriev's proposal didn't receive much enthusiasm in the US. Perhaps the bag of goodies wasn't sweet or large enough, on one hand. On the other hand, Trump's primary focus right now isn't on building economic ties with Moscow, but rather on showing his voters the result he has achieved. is specifically the cessation of hostilities. Trump stated that he should just snap his fingers and peace would reign in Ukraine. Dmitriev is not responsible for peace. His role concerns economic temptations. Apparently, Washington didn't take the bite. Why? Trump is starting from a policy that, if not maximum assistance to Putin, reflects a distinctly asymmetric view. He grants Putin significantly more than Ukraine. Indeed, it was a symbolic gesture when they lifted sanctions on Dmitriev and invited him to talk in Washington. This was perhaps a highly demonstrative action. However, the demonstrative action that Trump eagerly and generously distributes or promises are one thing, whereas the implementation of real decisions is quite another. It seems to me that Dmitriev was not convincing enough. The fact that he was invited and some sanctions were temporarily lifted from him was certainly a concession to Putin, much like the previously too lenient concession offered in the statements that Ukraine would not join NATO and would have to cede part of its territories. This was, of course, a significant advantage for Putin. However, it seemed insufficient. He apparently demands that Ukraine surrender those parts of the territory that he has been unable to conquer for over 3 years. It's like the cherry on the top of Trump, relatively speaking. Ukraine neutrally refused. In general, the United States likely understands that this would be excessive, even in the policy of appeasing Putin. Thus, it seems to me that the period of intense mutual sentiment between Russia and the US is coming to the end, and the honeymoon is over. The month of bitterness is beginning, if we speak in terms of wedding history. The other day, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio remarked that Trump, as they say, will not fall into the trap of endless negotiations that Moscow is trying to impose. First, it's important to know that Rubio is among the American high ranking officials most wary of Russia. This seems from his personal background and various political views, which means he cannot be seen as someone willing to make excessive concessions to Putin. Next, it's clear what will unfold. Putin has demanded the mobilization of 160,000 people during the spring draft, a number that has never been seen before. Typically, it's been around 130,000. It is evident that these 18-year-old boys who will be drafted will quickly find themselves under immense pressure from officers, veterans, and the entire army structure, which will require them as to sign a contract. In other words, conscripts will swiftly become contract volunteers. After all, it is quite challenging for an 18-year-old boy to resist pressure from older individuals, especially from those with experience who may use various means of coercion, including physical tactics. This leads to the straightforward conclusion that Putin doesn't plan to halt the fighting. Indeed, this hardly needs further proof, especially after the shelling of Kryvyi Rih. Putin is a man who understands only the language of force, and he has repeatedly demonstrated this. In this sense, he is similar to Trump, sharing a sincere and deep contempt for international agreements, his own promises, and words. Therefore, while the issues will be resolved on the battlefield, it will be Trump who does the resolving. He has already stated multiple times that if I feel Putin is acting incorrectly, I will be forced to take tough measures even though I do not want to. We already see the Senate's readiness to impose new, much harsher sanctions against Russia. Most notably, what is particularly troubling for Russia pertains to the oil fleet and the oil sector. Discussions are underway about 500% duties, among other things, on purchases of Russian oil. This is very serious if implemented, of course. If you remember, at least 30% of Russian GDP comes from oil. So if United States impose those sanctions, it will badly hit the Russian economy, which already been struggling for the last year or two. So in general, Trump possesses leverage. However, we cannot predict how Putin will respond to the escalating rhetoric. Here, he likely expects Trump, like Biden, to be intimidated by the threat of nuclear war. This expectation is quite reasonable, as allowing nuclear conflict in Europe would be a failure for any rational politician. Unfortunately, it doesn't feel like we're witnessing a conflict between two rational politicians. Instead, it resembles two stubborn animals with horns clashing on the same bridge. Nevertheless, Trump employs tough non military methods to apply pressure on Russia, while Putin lacks alternatives to military force for advancing his interests. Therefore, this is the worst option for resolving the situation. By the way, Putin has remained silent about nuclear weapons, which might be a bad sign since he has actively threatened to use them in the past. This silence could be interpreted as an unwillingness to use them seriously. Now that he's quiet, he likely understands that this would only serve as an additional irritant for Trump. However, when the interests of two major powers clash, and those states are led by individuals with limited common sense, one must consider that a conflict between nuclear powers could potentially arise. In general, one might have considered this when Putin began the war, but he anticipated it would be a small, triumphant procession in ceremonial tunics through Kiev. Instead, a large, destructive, and exhausting war erupted due to unexpectedly strong resistance from Kiev. Consequently, the extent of Putin's fury remains unknown to anyone. Therefore, we must say that we are not on the brink of nuclear war. However, its likelihood has significantly increased. War has its own logic. Figures like Putin and Trump are not inclined to retreat and may not even know how. Moreover, in terms of advancing, there is essentially nowhere to go except towards the same global threats. It would be dreadful, but indeed, it was worth contemplating on February 24 of 2022. US Ambassador to Ukraine Bridget Brink responded to the Russian missile strike on Kryvyi Rih on the social network X. Once again, she didn't mention Russia's involvement. Instead, she asserted that this shelling is the reason why this war must end. This can be interpreted as Bridget attempting not to upset Trump, given that she is his subordinate. Indeed, the tone of the statement is very reminiscent of Trump. There is a war underway. It doesn't matter who initiated it or who is the aggressor versus who is defending their country from outside aggressor. These details hold little significance for the United States. What matters is ending the war, and overall, the specific terms are not a priority. This reflects a typical Triumphant approach. Trumpian approach. Sorry. This approach closely resembles the primitive, low quality geopolitical antics of 19th or 20th centuries. When some locals clash, it irritates the big white master who feels compelled to intervene in their quarrel. What matters is who attacked whom, who is right, who is to blame, whether they should be separated or punished, and so on. As Trump himself remarked, maybe Ukraine will be part of Russia, maybe it won't. We will see. It, in reality, he doesn't care. That's why the ambassador makes certain statements about a devastating war with horrific casualties, 20 deaths, half of whom were children. Who started the war, who struck first, is not just a second order concern, but generally unimportant from her perspective. This is a view from a crystal city on a hill, where down in the valley some Slavs are fighting, and the priority is to separate them. On what terms, you would ask? After all, America isn't too invested in this. Therefore, I would not say there is a desire to avoid angering Putin. I would instead argue that this is a vivid manifestation of Trumpist approach. By the way, for Americans and American voters, this really appears this way to many. It resembles the mid 1990s conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda, during which about a million people were killed. In Europe as well as in Ukraine and Russia, it was definitely reported in the news. But who initiated it? What is the history of the conflict? Who is right? Who is to blame? Somehow people were not very interested. Somewhere in Africa, they are killing each other. This is, of course, bad and must be stopped. However, public opinion at that time in European countries, including Ukraine and Russia, was largely disconnected from the essence of this problem. The average American voter, along with Trump as his representative, tends to view the war in Ukraine similarly. A common perspective among Mr. Trump's supporters is maybe Ukraine is a historical part of Russia. Maybe it's not so clear. Maybe Putin has his own truth. However, this viewpoint is misleading, and Europe recognizes this just as they understand the consequences of appraising an aggressor. Meanwhile, a coalition of the willing is being formed in Ukraine. Although it is not fully established, progress is being made forward toward its formation, and I believe it will happen sooner or later. Indeed, if this coalition successfully creates a platform for dialogue with both Putin and Zelensky, then Macron has a strong chance of becoming a key figure. In any case, it seems clear that he wishes to pursue this road. He generally intends to and has declared his aim to take numerous steps to enhance France's position with the European Union. Furthermore, it appears that he seeks to become the driving force of the European Union following the United Kingdom's departure. As far as I understand, he is quite inclined to join this coalition of goodwill or the coalition of the willing. It seems to me that the primary issue now is to form some kind of a bloc. Only then, on behalf of this bloc, will you have to talk to Putin, one way or another. You won't get anywhere without doing this, you understand. The decision of lack of decision regarding peace in the Ukrainian war, which has particularly exhausted Russia, hinges on this. I'm not talking strictly about Ukraine. Any war eventually ends. The question is on what terms. Regarding the European status, Putin and the Trumpists find themselves very much aligned. They harbor a deep and genuine disdain for Europe. This sentiment is not just implied, it has been stated explicitly. Medvedev and others, including Putin himself, key figures in Russian politics, genuinely believe that Europe is cowardly, burghers, tolerant. Call it what you will, using any terms from Russian propaganda. We must acknowledge that Europe has done much to deserve this treatment. It was unable to stand up to Putin following the Georgian war. Recall that a 6 point agreement was made with French President Nicolas Sarkozy, of which Russia violated 2 points immediately. First, it didn't withdraw troops to the previously agreed lines with Sarkozy. Second, the agreement mandated the absence of unilateral actions. Yet, Russia swiftly and literally recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And what did did Western Europe do? Nothing. It remained silent. The same goes for the occupation of Crimea. Western Europe remained silent. Putin concluded that Russian gas, Russian oil, burgers, peace, and so on are more valuable to Europe than principles. If Putin has if Putin had faced resistance from the same Europe during early stages of its evolution, perhaps the war in Ukraine could have been avoided. But that is speculation. For now, focusing on concrete results, he deduced that Europe had fallen in love with the toxic muscularity of those who support Putin and Trump. In general, they don't know how to fight, don't want to, and deemed too deemed weak, and so on. So we need the European Union and Ukraine allies to wake up before this monster erases to the continent from the earth and turn the European cities into the ruins. The Europe should understand it will not end in Ukraine only. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.